Sorry to force you, but we have 1 hour and 4 speakers, and it's gonna be hectic. Thank you to the second panel of the morning, and it's gonna be on the Baltic perspective on EU enlargement. What kind of EU enlargement do we want? My name is Jānis Berziņš. I'm the Director for EU Policies and Coordinations at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and on a daily basis, I try to answer exactly this question. So now I have the fantastic opportunity to listen to actual people that research this, so I get more information for my job. So I'm not going to say much, but I'd like to introduce our panel. First, to my far right is Ambassador Erik Marmei, a distinguished and accomplished diplomat. Before becoming the ambassador to Estonia's most important neighbor, he was the main think tanker in the policy planning department of in the Estonian Foreign Service. Then we have David Beecher, a lecturer and living proof of common ground between parents of various backgrounds. He specializes in identity, integration, and cultural exchange. Then we have Kārlis Bukovskis. He's the head of the non-government foreign policy think tanker, professor and creator and host of a radio show, and his main research interests revolves around EU and challenges of political economy. And last but not least, Justinas Mickus represents the Lithuanian Government Strategic Analysis Center, focusing on foreign policy, strategic foresight, and planning. Research interests also include integration, political economy, and economic security. What you can expect from this panel is that we're gonna, in true spring fashion, tailor it to ice hockey. So we're gonna have 3 periods, and don't spoil the surprise. And since we are talking about the EU, so we have to apply EU Ministerial Council rules in order to keep time. So the normal procedure is, and this is where think tankers get to feel like I do often, 3 minutes per intervention. So try to keep that time. Now, as we already heard before, in the face of realpolitik and to counter Russia's war, the EU's answer is a liberal one. Expand its own architecture beyond current borders and establish clear boundaries between the collective West and the rest. The EU has finally recognized the aspirations of countries in its orbit and is willing to consider their bid for membership. The somewhat sudden new life to EU enlargement has reopened old debates on treaty change, decision-making procedures, and the overall institutional construct of the EU. It has also created new ones: how to align new members with the Lisbon Treaty, EU, which goes well beyond an economic union of common acquis communautaire. In the mix, we also have renewed debates on what does this mean for those candidate countries that have been waiting for 20 and more years. The current president of the European Council has a clear timeline: enlargement ready by 2030. That is former prime minister and former foreign minister aspired to have a done deal within the next European Parliament, and that's what our government is trying to do. So opening the first period, we see that we have a clear, ambitious target, and the question is, what can Baltic politicians and civil society do to ensure that enlargement actually occurs around 2030, rather than being stalled as it was with the integration of Balkan countries? And first, I'd like to ask the ambassador to maybe give his perspective on what we should do.
All right. Thank you, Jānis. I usually go to see Jānis at the ministry to answer the same questions and or ask the same questions, and then Jānis answers me, so I'm in an awkward position here. But thank you very much. Yes, this 2030 readiness perspective is really an ambitious one. I recall I think Estonia started the whole process back in 1995 with the ambition of becoming EU member at some point. We were the one of the 5 that was invited to the negotiation process in December 97. And then we became member 1st of May 2004. So the process for us took about 10 years. So if we expect that that 2030 the next enlargement really would occur, then this is really ambitious. Now, I think we can all agree that the last enlargement, or the Big Bang enlargement in 2004, was a geopolitical enlargement, and the next one will be geopolitical as well, especially when Ukraine and Moldova and hopefully Georgia will also join. There were a lot of fears and concerns before 2004 enlargement, when the Baltic states and 7 others joined. There were fears of how do we deal with the decision-making process, that it would slow down. There were fears about budgetary processes, that the budget of the EU will not collapse, but there would be difficulties in consolidating it. There were problems with agriculture sector, which then so eastern part of Europe brought to the Union, and also the issue of cheap labor. And at some point, I recall that, I was in UK in 2005, and then there was BBC did those news broadcasts from the countryside where ordinary Brits were complaining about cheap labor from Eastern Europe, that they were picking broccoli, and they were demonstrating against this cheap labor force. And then the question was, but so why don't you pick those broccolis yourself? And they said, oh no, we will not be doing that. Then the question really was that, so what was the point of on one hand, there was the resistance to Eastern European labor, and at the same time fears that these people would take away their jobs, but that of course never happened. There was this famous case of Polish plumber that we all know. And then, do we have Finnish embassy here? Yes, and I think when we joined Schengen, then also there were negotiations, and then Finns were really against us joining Schengen, and the fear was that then 400,000 Estonians would go to live and work in Finland, which would be roughly 1/3 of Estonian population. Of course, that never happened again, and so I think those fears are present today as well when we talk about the next enlargement. Clearly, we have to understand that the positive effect of the enlargement clearly outweighs the negative ones, and I think that we should also show example of how it worked in the past. But it has to be said here that the enlargement remains strictly performance-based and merit-based, and also the EU cannot give false expectations to those countries who are eager to join EU, and they have to fulfill all the criteria, all the acquis that is set. So tough, a tough expectation, but the declaration to be ready by 2030 is a correct one, and we have to work on this.
Thank you. So I hear transparent on about benefits and strict on progress, no free pass. David, your view take.
Sure. Yes, I can't speak to the technical aspects of this, as my view is more of that of a historian, and that is also of somebody who has sort of thought about the larger problem in the project of Europe. I think one way to approach this is to ask the question is, why has EU enlargement stalled in the past? Why have we had trouble getting there? And I think the problem is that two of our values are in tension. On the one hand, we have this view that enlargement is good, and on the other hand, enlargement is dangerous. Enlargement is dangerous because it can bring in Trojan horses, it can bring in all kinds of influences that might actually eat Europe from the inside out. It's dangerous because because of the question or problem of imperial overreach. The more we expand, the more widely distributed our resources are, the less less importance there is for any one given part. The smaller percentage any one given part is of the whole. And I think until we had this sort of crisis of the last couple of years, until it really became apparent, the priority of expansion being or enlargement being good was kind of offset by the fear of the danger of what this might bring. I think now we have a kind of momentum for expanding and for enlarging that we didn't have before. But in many ways, I think the key issue here, it might be the elephant in the room that's not really in any one of the 3 points of our discussion here. It's not markets, it's not rule of law, it's not geopolitics, and it's the problem of democracy. In many ways, you could say Europe is this is the greatest challenge to Europe too, is the populism of the recent years, and populism as an example of as a consequence of, in some sense, an unsatisfied democracy. A democracy people have spoken about the democratic deficit in the EU. We had not only Brexit, but we had Grexit. We had a lot of sort of moments where the question of whether whether existing members wanted to be part of this of the EU was called into the question. I think the one thing that the Baltic sort of here can give, and one way can help sort of move us towards getting this enlargement to happen in 2030 is as an example of one of the more successful parts of the integration of a democratically willing sort of population into the European project. The fear, of course, is in producing another Hungary and another Orban and another situation where we have the principles being undermined from the outside. But in some ways, I think, to conclude, just that the point here is it's very hard to sell Europe or to convince others of the good of Europe if we don't have our own house in order, if we don't have sort of a democratic majority that actually believes in the principles that the elites are talking about. And the moment when those things come into conflict or to discord, everything stalls again, everything stops again. And so long as that kind of discord is there will be no enlargement in 2030. So the best thing we can do in some ways, I think, is to strengthen democratic institutions and to bring kind of, and not to treat the people not simply as a group to be sold or manipulated or to be convinced, but to be in some ways incorporated into the whole prospect and act of creating Europe not merely as a set of technical procedures, but Europe as a set of values.
Excellent. So counter populist movements and keep our house in order. Kārlis.
Yes.
Your take.
My take. Thank you, colleagues, very much for the opportunity to be here, especially for Maria for inviting me. 4 points, I guess. Well, I have to be slightly provocative, but I'm happy that sometimes people are complaining that I'm on the second panel, I'm the third in a row who's answering. Everything has been already said. I'm happy about it because it means that we are on the same page. I agree with Jan Bond, absolutely. Previously said, and Ambassador was also mentioning this, that we should, in order to have an actual enlargement, we have to avoid the situation that Russia enters the European Union through a back door. That's the major concern. That's the biggest concern that everybody in the European Union at the moment have. So in this case, the countries who are applying, who are becoming members of the European Union, they actually have to have their geopolitical vectors in order and clarity on this, and reassure the partners whom they're going to be engaging for many decades to come after they're part of the European Union, that this is what they align with. The second is that we should have an immovable belief of enlargement both to east and also to the Balkan countries. And this is where the Baltic states are slightly failing, because we are extremely happy to support Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. Whenever it comes to the Balkan countries, then all of a sudden we're like, yeah, well, it's up to European Commission. If they say they're good, then we're gonna, it's the position that we have. And that is not inspiring the Western Balkan countries. It's logically that it's not inspiring them in any form, and reassuring them that they are welcome, they are expected, we are waiting for them to be part of that. So in this case, we have to be more active on this. Then the Ambassador Marmei also mentioned about the merit-based system. Of course, merit-based system, it has been there. We joined the European Union based on the merits. It was an asymmetric integration, using Frank Schimmelpfennig's terminology. It was absolutely, we at that point, we saw ourselves as, well, inferior to the West, right? And we needed to do our homework. We did it. We accessed the European Union. The same principle is still, the mentality is there. We don't want any free riders. We don't want any just gifts to be given to anybody. So in this case, the situation is that it has to still be merit-based approach. But, with small but, I don't believe that we should expect always 5-star results. On the average, 4 out of 5, perfectly fine for countries to join the European Union. There are always the transition periods. In Latvian case, we set the record with, what was it, 35 transition issues on the transition, which we implemented in the 7 years after we already were part of the European Union. So there should be possibilities for a bit more flexibility than just a yes and no question. And finally, I've been saying this before, I like this provocation. In order to ensure that the next enlargement happens, what about we set the deadline? What about, let's say, 2035 is the deadline, which is the final EU enlargement? I know Jānis is going to ask the question later on, where I'm going to address a bit more in detail why it's from the domestic perspective, why it's important from the French perspective, why from this out, well, from the German perspective, why it is important for the societies, domestic societies, to have the understanding that, yeah, well, the European Union is not going to continue enlarging and enlarging. It's not a continuous widening. It's not continuous deepening. Yes, widening, not necessarily. But from the outside perspective, to actually signal this, EU accession is a sport. It is a sport. Why cannot it be said as a sport? Countries are, when the Baltic states were joining, remember, we were struggling. Who's going to be the best? Who's going to be the one? Who's going to be doing the best when we are going to be entering the European Union? Why not to have the same moment now and tell to the countries, you have been in a pre-accession situation, many of you, for decades. There are countries who joined the European Union 3-4 years after submitting the application into the European Union. Some countries which joined in 9 years, right? So there's a question, maybe there's a deadline. This is what you have to go for. This is the final enlargement of the European Union. Either you're in or you're out. I think my 3 minutes are over.
Yeah, and so just, I mean, you had to balance the Estonian side, right? So 4 points, CFSP alignment at core, don't forget the Balkans, negotiate transitions, and make it a competition.
Yep.
Justinas, our neighbor to the south.
All right, thank you very much. I also will not complain for being in the second panel, now the fourth speaker, but I do have a lot of my content emptied out. But again, this points to a certain shared vision, which I think is both natural and good. However, I'll try to say a few things that are, I hope, new and that balance between the more academic perspective of David's and maybe more government-aligned perspective, since I represent a government-affiliated but analytical institution. So I think on the more academic side, I've always been maintaining that one major obstacle to enlargement, if we view enlargement as a way of economic and political integration. It's on the spectrum where, there are free trade deals, there are other kinds of economic partnerships, there are institutionalized cooperation, among non-integrated allies, etc. At some point down the line, the most extreme end of the spectrum is enlargement. It's the most maybe robust way of integrating nation states that we have. I think all along the spectrum we see relative failures at the EU level, but more globally. There is a certain fatigue in integration, we talk of globalization on the global stage. We talk about EU's or the US's inability to sign, for example, free trade deals, etc. And I think at the root of a lot of these issues and this overall trend, if we set aside for a second like geopolitical challenges, but what comes from within, is quite an acute sense of economic insecurity. And I think this is especially, the case with a lot of Western European countries, highly urbanized, where housing precarity, for example, contributes, in addition to precarity of jobs, housing situation can contribute to economic insecurity that then heightens fears of new people, new societies joining our union, taking a part of in the welfare, etc. So, but it also, I think, will increasingly impact our region, which has so far been on an upswing and has had this positive narrative of economic transformation. But we're coming into a middle-income trap. None of our 3 Baltic states are doing particularly good at integrating at high-value chains. Estonia, of course, has some successes, but still within the high-value chains, it occupies more of a middle ground position. We will feel the squeeze, especially when we're talking about a highly digital society such as Ukraine. And there will be an economic insecurity that we'll have to grapple with. And I think there are many tools at the EU level and the national level of economic transformation that we need to pursue. And I definitely think enlargement here is actually a positive. Ian made a great point, I think, of enlargement being an investment in the future geoeconomic order where we consolidate our economic base. And I think by allowing new supply chains, by allowing new modes of industrial policy, etc., enlargement can be an investment. So that's a more academic point. I think we need to put economic security, household economic security, and I guess state economic security at the center, and use that as an argument for enlargement, A, but B, also a roadmap of what kind of reforms do we need to make in the Baltics as well as in the EU overall. And the Baltics can be a call for action here. But on a more technical level, I wanted to just highlight, not repeating anything that's been said, with which I wholeheartedly agree. Somebody mentioned, I think Funda mentioned the levels of support, public support in enlargement, and that it varies in the EU. But up until 28, we have 4 countries with over 70% support for enlargement chairing the EU presidency, and that's Poland, Ireland, Lithuania, and Latvia. We have a pretty good roadmap for the next 4 years of countries, of course, the EU Council presidency, not a super decisive position, but it can control the agenda, it can push some agendas forward, etc. We need to, and we can coordinate at that level, at an institutional level, to maintain the momentum of enlargement as a part of the EU discussion as it continues, as it falters. And at the same time, and very importantly, knowing that it will falter because some of the other council presidencies, upcoming council presidencies, are not so keen on enlargement. We have Hungary. We need to really work with the EU institutions. I think at times the Commission's role will be crucial, and we need to make sure that there's a Baltic commissioner for enlargement, perhaps, or that at least the DG NEAR is active and well-staffed rather than, peripheral. So yeah, focus on economic security, focus on the EU institutions and what opportunities they create, and then all of what my panelists said is, I guess, my takeaway.
Very, very interesting. For me, that sounded like countering economic insecurities at home, for something politicians to do, and then use the chain of pro-enlargement presidencies and run away with it. So clearly we have things to do that we can do at home. But then there's the question of what can we do to help the candidate countries actually achieve their merit. Mm-hmm. And since you were so opposed to being last, you're going to be first now, so we're going to reverse the order.
I wasn't opposed. I sat myself down here. I took it as an inevitability. But yeah, I mean, I can only echo what the ambassador said, that Lithuania's official position, of course, is merit-based and as speedy as possible, meaning that we cannot sacrifice any of the fundamental commitments to value. We don't need to strive for perfection, but a good enough has to still be a good, robust good enough. But it has to be fast, meaning that we really need to help our candidate countries, both the Eastern Trio and the Balkans, where we can, where we have certain strengths, to get to the finishing line. And I mean, I'm not the best spokesperson for all of Lithuania's, for example, civil society and what its relative strengths or not strengths are, but just like seeing the documents that have been produced over the last couple of years where, for example, facilitated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in cooperation with civil society, what kind of priority programs there are for helping, for example, Ukraine's reform agenda. I see 3 highlights, and they are in education. We have great needs to both restore, modernize public education systems, bring them closer to sort of EU and I guess OECD standards that would, prepare, I guess, Ukraine's society, but this can be, of course, scaled up to other candidate countries for better accession. Healthcare system, especially focus on psychosocial, which is a huge issue in a future post-war society. And then gender equality. I guess Lithuania doesn't have a stellar, I would say, record on gender equality, but there are some notable strengths, especially in women's participation in academia and STEM specifically, but also, reintegration into the labor markets, which is on the one hand important, when we consider motherhood, but also much more broadly, reintegration in the labor markets post, such disruptions as currently happening in Ukraine. So these are the 3 already identified areas. I think that an emerging area where Lithuania can really help is the public sector governance reform based on real-time data-driven governance solutions. We've pulled up and opened up all of our data, and it's tracked and can be used real-time. It's relatively new, I guess, in the European space, and I think there's great potential to introduce that to our partners, the candidate countries. I also think that at least Lithuania has a very, very strong youth politics dimension, especially in terms of election observation, disseminating information about candidates, so sort of strengthening the electoral process, making it more robust. So there's, I think, also great capacity for facilitating civil society dialogue. So again, what's officially declared and what's maybe potential out there represents, I think, a wide range of options. And my main point then is, obviously, to create more of these purpose-driven formats where we gather a lot of stakeholders and identify strengths, ideally not on a national basis, but on a regional basis, and then put them into, work streams, whether it's twinning projects, whether it's some kind of EU programs, maybe OECD programs. I know that OECD is now taking the lead on the agriculture debate, specifically as regards to Ukraine, and Lithuania is an active participant there, and so on and so forth. So there's many of opportunities. I think the government is there to facilitate, support, and sometimes lead the way.
Thank you, Justinas, and for reminding us that also equality is a core value, not just democracy and rule of law. Kārlis, your take.
Yes, thank you. 5 points. Justinas already covered the twinning.
3 minutes.
3 minutes, I know. No worries. The twinning is usually a success story because it is teaching the know-how. It is engaging. It is being present. It is being helping, and it is showing empathy. It is showing it's embracing the new potential countries. It's also building the relationships after the membership. So in this case, of course, for the Baltic states and all the other countries to be engaged in as much as possible in different sectors of different institutions, different line ministries, and different potential candidate countries in twinning projects. That is important. Engaging academia, that's part of it's kind of an obvious thing, but from the other point of view, very often we get to the situation that in academia we have so many people who don't believe in European Union in countries which are not in European Union. Why? Well, because they are kind of afraid what's going to happen. So and many of them are stakeholders. Many of them are educators. They have their audiences. They have their impact on more than just their own understanding and their own close community. So therefore, in this case, having more active engagement is an important. Another one, engaging with veto players, domestic veto players. Funda was saying about the international veto players, but I'm saying domestic veto players. Unfortunately, as it is, we have to speak to those who actually can hurdle the process. Sometimes those are oligarchs. Sometimes those are power structures. Sometimes those are politicians whom we don't want to get on the same page, but it's actually the reality is that everybody has to be spoken to. That's one of the things that actually goes forward. Two-speed approach should be avoided. In case of the Baltic states, that has done enough damage in history that we're still trying to solve till this day. And I believe that also in case of Serbia, also in case of Georgia, we should not give up. It should be the same track, should be the same deadline. Sorry, I'm going to stick to this. And finally, we should not disregard Russia's influences. Russia will be playing much more than it used to in the 90s. In the 90s with us, it didn't have necessarily the capacity to do that, didn't understand fully the importance of the European Union. NATO was the primary concern. But now we are in a different situation where Russia is going to use the propaganda tools, it's going to use political corruption tools, state capture tools, whatever it's going to have at its expense. Plus, trust me, China is going to do the same thing. It's a playing field which is much more complicated now with the countries who are now joining the European Union than it used to be back in the 90s.
Okay, thank you. David?
So the question is still, what is our contribution to
helping them?
Helping them.
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess just two short answers. First is which in some ways echoes one thing I said earlier, just this idea of being a model, of showing what is possible and how. Being a good example on every level of sort of a civil society. Perhaps also making good on a point that was made by the Finnish international lawyer and historian of law, Matti Koskiniemi, about about a debate about sovereignty in Finland too. That you can make the argument that you actually expand sovereignty by joining the EU, and that it's not, if it's your choice to join the EU, it's not giving up sovereignty. It's a sort of really short-sighted to say it's either sovereignty or the EU, and that's really a false sort of formulation of the question, which a lot of people have simply taken over. But you can make the convincing argument that you're not actually giving up sovereignty by joining the EU, and showing how that's possible, I think, is one thing that the Baltic states could, in their own way, model for the rest of, or for the states that are trying for accession now. The second point, simply that I would maybe call the civil society partnerships, and it's being the idea that. In recent years, I think the human rights movement has discovered that one of the problems with the human rights movement, with Amnesty International, with Human Rights Watch, is that they go to other places and tell people what they're doing wrong, what they need to do right. And there's something very arrogant about that. And what they've discovered, and I think something we could apply here, is this notion that, and Amnesty is doing this more now, but is to go there and ask them what they need and how to help them, and to sort of join with and to support the organizations that are already there in civil society. So you have a civil society partnership rather than a civil society organization that goes out to try to transform them. And that becomes a much more inclusive process then, and it becomes something that actually, I think, enhances the major value, which always seems to be most at danger here, is democracy, ultimately. The sense that people are actually being included in the process, and it's not elites coming to tell them what they have to do.
Making sure that there's respect for human rights is just another value in Article 2. Yeah. Ambassador.
Right. Maybe to add a few points here. I think the whole idea of European Union is to enhance stability, well-being, prosperity, democracy, values, and we can help those countries to become part of that dream that they can only that they are working hard towards, but sometimes they are lacking behind in practical issues, and so I think first and foremost the idea is that the Baltic states, as being in the front line, should also help to consolidate the support for that geopolitical change, and And what I mean by that is to really push back on Russian imperialist aggression, which is a very long-term and difficult perspective, as we all know. We know from the past. But there are also then very practical things that we can help with, and that's the reforms, internal reforms of these countries. First and foremost, that comes to mind is to help to fight against corruption. Corruption is a big problem of all these candidate countries. Help them to enhance rule of law, judiciary reform. Also help them to modernize their business environment and investment environment, and I think, and the point of tackling really the malign and hybrid actions of Russia that Kārlis was talking about. These are all the issues that I think the Baltic states can help from our perspective and from our past experience. And I think that we know better at this point also how to deal with these very practical issues in the process of the negotiations towards EU.
All right. When entering our third and final period, it looks like we have a plan, and enlargement can be a success, and it will definitely be to the benefit of the candidate countries to be part of the Euro-Atlantic architecture. But what is your view on the impact of EU enlargement on the development in the Baltic states? What should we do to increase our own positive effect? And just to keep time, 1 point per speaker. Ambassador, the most important point, how to increase the positive effect.
The positive effect. I think we already see a lot of positive effects from the enlargement process, and especially from Ukraine. I think I think the enlargement process will bring about decision-making changes as well. The shift, the power balance shift, will move more towards the east. I think Eastern European countries will have more in that decision-making processes. Ukraine has already become a major military force in Europe in recent years, especially after the war started. And I think that Ukrainian resistance has consolidated European geopolitical power through the better defense cooperation and also defense capabilities build-up, which was not the case before the war. So those capabilities, I think, have improved immensely. Ukrainian defense industry will add to that to those capabilities. I think there are a lot of possibilities for the after-war reconstruction, but that applies also.
1 point.
Okay.
1 point.
So for the European companies, and there's a lot that we can learn also from the IT, digital, and cyber capabilities that would benefit the whole EU as well, and of course the Baltic states.
Kārlis, your 1 point.
1 point.
One. Most important. Okay, 1 point.
Well, most important. May I have 1.5?
No.
First of all, if you want to sell the enlargement to the Baltic states, to the Baltic societies, numbers should be given. It's not only about the values, it's not only about the principles. People are going to find out. People are going to ask the questions: how much it costs, how much money we're going to lose. We have to be blunt and honest about it. We actually have to tell our societies, because otherwise people are going to be looking for alternative information, and that, of course, is going to be coming from the sources that we definitely don't want, and which is going to be filled up with lies and misinformation. And half the point, sorry. I think we should finally start emphasizing that it is an honorable position to be donor countries. The Baltic states have, for 20 years, we have been the net recipient countries, and we have been looking at the European Union as well. This is where the money comes from. I think that 2 decades is the moment when we have to start finally changing the narrative and saying that we not only deserve, we are in the position that we should be seeing ourselves as the new generation of the EU member states, or in this case, there's a generation of people who has been growing up in the European Union and born in the European Union who deserve to associate themselves as somebody who is helping others, not only be always helped to.
Okay, Justinas, your 1 point.
Right. Yeah, the 2 previous interventions really helped me narrow down the list, because I fully agree on the importance of Ukrainian defense. I already myself mentioned the digital and cyber finesse that we can learn from a lot. I completely agree with that, how positive of an impact it will be to mentally switch from being a net recipient and a sort of follower to a co-creator and a donor. But then, because I agree with these points and still want to be original, I would say maybe the enlargement and the prospect of it is very impactful, both in a positive and negative way. Positive if we meet the challenge, by really showcasing what's unsustainable about our growth trajectories and like forcing the change. Insofar as our economic transformation and success story has been, well, A, commendable, and B, maybe fit for the times, but based a little bit on sort of labor arbitrage, somewhat cheaper labor costs. We know that that's not a very sustainable prospect, even if there were no enlargement, because we can outsource services to third parties across the globe, for example. So it really forces us to think about the economic and, I guess, socioeconomic transformations that we need and want in the Baltic states, which we would and should want either way. But with what we perceive as a good thing of enlargement motivating us further, I hope that can lead to sustained and productive structural reform in our countries that sometimes we otherwise struggle a little bit, or at least the country I know best struggles with.
Excellent. David, your 1 point.
I'll try to keep this really short.
Yes.
Maybe just to summarize everything then. And the point is simply that the biggest positive, I think, implication of EU enlargement for the Baltic states is that it gives us a larger security community, and a security community that's guaranteed not simply by on a geopolitical level, but through the expansion of the rule of law and human rights, through the expansion or through the integration of markets in the economy, and that is perhaps the greatest net benefit that we can derive from this.
Thank you. Since 2 out of 3 games were won in overtime, we have to have overtime, right? And for the overtime, I'm going to open it to the audience for targeted questions, and please state your name and affiliation and who your question is targeted to. I see 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Thank you. Skytte Struberga, Latvian Transatlantic Organization. Actually, I have 2 questions. The first one goes regarding Balkans. Balkans were mentioned. And how to sell the Balkans agenda in here. I'm afraid that here in Baltic there is no much knowledge about Balkans as such. How many experts do we have on Balkans actually? And the question is how to inform the society about Balkans and topical issues, and how to and then we can ask how to convince our society about enlargements in direction of Balkans. And the second question goes to the moment which Kārlis said that we need deadline, and then we will have new member states. But what we see from the analysis, like for example, 2 weeks ago, it was released in the journal Latvian Interests in EU. Professor Steinbuka and Ozoliņa, they analyzed the impact of EU in economics, in education system, etc. And one of the points was that we have missed so many opportunities. And by example, it was mentioned there. And it was really about the discipline and our commitment. Do you think maybe we should, in parallel of demand what we have during accession process, maybe we should inform candidate states or potential candidate states that the demand for discipline will not end up when the deadline will be reached and they will be in. Maybe this process of education should start now.
Maybe we can take all the 3 questions and then combine them together.
Hello, Greta, Center for Quality Advancement, ESO in Lithuania. So I have 2 points as well. You were speaking about integration and how we must speak with every side and how we must integrate women and, not integrate women, but about them strengthening women. So first point is, how do you feel being the male-only panel? And with only pros for EU enlargement as well. And the second point, since we speaking about European values and indivisible human rights, how do you feel about what happened during a hybrid migration crisis and all the breaches in human rights near the border of Latvia, Poland, and Lithuania? Thank you.
And there's a question. In the meantime, I can answer the panel question. We feel awful. Nothing we can do.
My name is Arturs Pīlāts. I'm the first course student in Latvian University Social Sciences faculty. And my question is furthering the idea of identity politics and identity politics in Europe. And it's about the religious convictions of future member states. It's clear that some of the countries are, they base their values on Judeo-Christian values or Islam values in the case of Turkey. And how do you see the role of identity politics in the expansion of Europe? Thank you.
Excellent. So I'm going to direct the questions, the Balkan question to the ambassador, the values integration and Turkish question to David, our expert on these issues, on the deadlines to Kārlis, and then hybrid and migration to Justinas. Who wants to start? And we have 5 minutes, by the way, for all the answers. Ambassador.
Yes, Balkans. Of course, I agree fully with you that we need to inform our societies more about the Western Balkan issues. But it's, in a way, it's difficult as well because we are more concentrating on eastern part of Europe, and I think all Baltic states are fully in tune with the overall European approach towards Western Balkans. We support the enlargement to those countries. But again, it's also, as I said earlier, it's merit-based approach, and we have to understand also their difficulties and how to help them to consolidate their societies in order to become ready for EU enlargement. But to be honest, I don't think that the Baltic states have that much capabilities and knowledge in that region. I think, for instance, Estonia has only one embassy in the region that covers most of the countries, and it's difficult to really focus on all of these countries equally. But we do our best, and of course, Western Balkans is part of the ideal of Europe, whole, free, and at peace, and so that's my answer.
We have a similar situation for our representation. Who wants to go next? Kārlis?
Yeah, sure. No, with the Balkans, a small remark. Well, for society, we have Baltic flights now to the Western Balkan countries, and that is actually cultural exchange and people familiarizing themselves with the region. That's part. But my main point was that it should be the political position, and it doesn't cost anything for our president or the prime minister or the minister of foreign affairs to say that, of course, we are for all the countries who want to join the European Union. So again, this is and the society. I don't believe that's going to revolt that no, Ukraine, yes, not Kosovo or not well, potentially Kosovo or not Montenegro. On the deadline, thank you. I know that this is a provocation, therefore I'm putting this out. See, the problem is, and it somewhat goes with the identity politics question as well. We are in a situation that there's a significant fatigue in especially in Western European countries of enlargement. Prolonged situation with Poland, many saw as a big problem. Orban's policies and take on the rule, many see as a problem. Immigration issue, which hasn't been actually solved in many countries, is seen as a big problem. Brexit happened, for most importantly, not only because of the lies perpetuated by the Russian bots, but also because of the immigration issue. And in this case, this fatigue of enlargement needs to be addressed. And so my suggestion is, let's make this as a sport for those who are accessing, and they have enough time to do that. Again, they don't have to be perfect. It's fine with doing 4 stars out of 5 on the average. But there's going to be a benchmark, there's going to be a deadline, there's going to be this. And for the rest of the society, those who are already in the European Union, it is a way how to say that, yeah, well, we understand, we hear you. We understand that you don't know where, when, and how this is going to end. So this is what it is. We propose, this is the final deadline, right? And the fact is that in 2035, after seeing the results, it can be still overlooked or can be changed. There's always a possibility like this, but I would still say that it's a stronger positioning, clearer positioning, because psychologically people are always more ready to go through the difficulties if they know how long they're gonna last, right? And so this is basically the question about the missed opportunities. Every country has missed something. We have missed something, that's absolutely sure. Those countries who are going to be joining in 2030, 2035, they're going to be joining. They're going to be missing opportunities as well. But the big question, of course, is about the post-accession conditionality. Because pre-accession conditionality, well, you want to join the club, you have to do the homework. Post-accession, that's always a question. It's a political, it's an economic, it's an academic, intellectual question. How do you deal with Orban's situation, right? How do you do this? And then it's a complex system of negotiations which is taking place. So I somewhat saw, I think, 3 questions in your one question, and I tried to answer them all. So thank you, Skytte.
Justinas, migration and human rights.
All right. Yeah, well, so insofar as the question was about feeling, I feel awful. I've been to one of the refugee camps, I guess, in Lithuania, and I saw what the conditions are, and I think it was a complete failure, both on the state and also the civil society, I have to say, with the exception maybe of the Catholic Church, in helping, providing the means and support, as well, social as well as material, in Lithuania to the migrants that were instrumentalized by the Belarusian regime and arrived at the situation. I understand I am sensitive to maybe the political circumstances that made it almost inevitable that Lithuania and Poland would have a fairly strict border protection policy. I also am sensitive to the fact that at least some of the policymakers thought that the tough stance at the border was to prevent a politicization of migration later on. I don't think that was particularly successful. Yeah, I think that it was a twofold, I think, unsuccess story. One in that we were, I think, sometimes too easy to be very strict, and on the other hand, didn't do nearly enough on the more positive agenda. But I do think that enlargement can contribute, at least to some extent, with the sort of conditions that are favorable for a better migration policy. By consolidating the EU's external border, especially I think in the Western Balkans, it can help make the border protection a little easier, maybe a lot easier, and then we can shift the focus into integration, assimilation, support for the third countries, and so on and so forth, that tackle the migration issue at the core. I do think that in the crisis circumstances, the policy options were significantly reduced, but with a future perspective, we have to think of both the values commitments as well as the horrible realpolitik of regimes that instrumentalize migrant flows.
Thank you. And in that segue to our dessert, how do we integrate various identities and create and define an EU identity, David?
I think Funda used the phrase "the more the merrier" in her presentation to talk about the virtues maybe that we're sort of aspiring to. And I guess the Latin phrase "e pluribus unum," out of many one, which is also, of course, on the every American coin. But this is the fundamental problem of any confederation and large organization: is how do you get one out of many? And it's the problem of any liberalism too, is how do you have a plurality, a multiplicity, and respect that, while at the same time not allowing that plurality and multiplicity become instrumentalized in order to become a weapon. It's ultimately, I think, the EU is in some ways, I wouldn't say that my position is entirely simply praising the EU all the time. I see its problems, and I see the problem also of the tension between democracy and the EU as a profound one. But I think the EU is in some ways our best hope to make sure that many of these identities do get integrated. If we don't have the EU, nobody's going to want to integrate them. If we want any of these questions to be raised about who gets heard and who doesn't get heard, who has a voice, who doesn't have a voice, we're going to have much less of a chance of having that discussion come to the table without the EU than we have with it. It's the one sort of force that's forcing countries to raise these questions. So that would be my concluding statement.
And on that note, it's time to end because the coffee break has started. Please give a loud thank you to the panelists and to the moderator as well. Have a great coffee break.